Hey, this is your favorite German compositor, Sebastian Schütt. Welcome back to Split the Diff. I hope everyone is excited for the second episode of... And as before, we will take a look under the hood of one of Nuke's nodes, and we will also look at ways of using it beyond its actual purpose. This time, it's all about the transform node. The node might look quite obvious on its surface, but I will talk about something not only relevant to Nuke, but computer graphics in general. We will take a deeper look at transformation matrices, vectors, as well as filtering and motion blur. This is your chance to catch up with the math behind this node. And since it's quite an extensive topic, I will split up this episode in two parts. This is part 1, the theory, followed up by part 2, which will be released soon, with very interesting production techniques, so watch out for it. If you're new to the channel and you've learned something, please like and subscribe. Otherwise, put on your seatbelt. Are you ready? Let's go! Transformations are geometrical changes of an object on a plane or coordinate system. This happens by mapping an input image from one set of locations to another. Nuke's transform node is a container, providing us with different operations to move images around, rotate them, or change their size and shape. Let's have a look at those individual operations to understand how complex this node actually is. Every point or pixel of an image is defined by using 2D vectors in a Cartesian coordinate system, with the origin vector being 0. As you will see later, the origin is very important because most of the transformations we do are done relative to it. In Nuke, when we work in 2D view, the origin is actually situated in the lower left corner and only quadrant 1 is visible. Nuke displays the coordinates on the fly at the bottom of the viewer. Translation is an additive operator. If we want to change the position of this point or vector, we can simply add another vector. This will give us a new set of coordinates. All the pixels of our image will then be mapped to the new location. For rotation, we use trigonometry. Since our mathematical operation will work relative to the origin, rotation actually consists of 3 individual steps. First, we gather the coordinates of the node's pivot, which we can define in the center knob of our transform node. For our example, I placed it right in the middle of this cube. We offset the image by this vector so it lines up with the origin. Only now the rotation happens. And at last we move the object back to its initial position. For the next example, I placed the center right at the origin. If we look at our vector again, and let's call it x sub 0 and y sub 0, then r would be the length of it. It is at an angle which we call theta. We now want to rotate that vector by an angle phi of, let's say, 30 degrees, which gives us a new point, x sub 1 and y sub 1. How do we get the exact coordinates for this new point? The same way we calculate side lengths of a triangle. The cosine of theta is the ratio of the adjacent, which is x sub 0, to the hypotenuse, which is r, the opposite side of the right angle. We can rewrite this by multiplying both sides with r. Let's look at the new vector. The length of it didn't change, so r is still the same. The new angle would be theta plus phi. This means we can define the following formula for x sub 1. We can do the same with y sub 1 by using the sine of theta, which is the length of the opposite side of the angle divided by the length of the hypotenuse r. With the help of trig identities, we can rewrite those formulas again. This would enable us to calculate the new point. We can rewrite all of this in matrix form, which will help us later on, but let's pause rotation for now. Scaling is multiplication. To scale a vector, we just need to do a simple multiply operation. Let's say we want to scale our points by 2. As with rotation, the origin is our reference point again. Now the only thing we need to do is multiply our x and y values with the x and y scale factor. If we use a factor of -1 for either one or both of the x and y values, we will end up with the reflection. -1 for x reflects about the y-axis, and -1 for y reflects about the x-axis. The coordinates of the pivot determine the position of the axis, of course. Last but not least, skewing or shearing. Skewing distorts the shape of an object by leaving points on one axis fixed, but shifting the other points parallel to the axis. Skew x shifts the x coordinates in a fixed direction and maintains the y coordinates. Skew y shifts the y coordinates and maintains the x coordinates. Again, all of this happens with the origin acting as reference point. Let's have a look at the formula and concentrate on the upper right point of this square. Based on the formula, we can ignore y since it will stay the same. For the new x value, we will have to multiply the skew x value, let's say we pick 1, with the y value, which is 60. 1 times 60 is 60. If we add this to the x value 80, we get 140. Let's check. Why do we end up with 95? Because like I said, everything happens around the origin. Let's imagine this square has been moved to the origin internally, with our center value right in the middle of it being 0. Then the upper right corner of the square would have x and y values of 15. If we send this through our formula, we will get a new x value of 30. With the square being moved back to its initial position, we can check again. If our pivot sits in the lower left corner of the square, we will get 30 plus 1 times 30, which is 60. And this is the formula for skew y. Since we are actually changing the shape of this object, it is important to define an order for which axis operation to calculate first, if we want to manipulate both the x and y axis. As you can see, the second operation picks up where the first one ended, so results can vary a lot if you change the order. Having inspected all those operations, imagine how long it would take to process all of those multiplications, additions, and trigonometric functions for each and every point or pixel of an image. Especially if you are working with very large resolutions or even in 3 dimensions. In order to keep things compact, consistent, and suitable for computation, in computer graphics we work with matrices. A matrix is a rectangular array of numbers, symbols, or expressions arranged in rows and columns. It can come in different dimensions. The vectors we worked with earlier are basically small matrices. Think of it as a set of values grouped together. We use matrices to combine and work with multiple linear equations. A linear transformation has 2 properties. All lines remain lines and the origin remains fixed in place. They can also be expressed with a single matrix multiplication. Let's have a quick look at the matrix we established for rotation earlier. I just want to quickly show you how matrix multiplication works. This universal matrix that we calculated for rotating points around the origin, we can use this now for any point of our object or image to determine the new coordinates after a rotation. And that's actually how Nuke is calculating it internally. We simply multiply this rotation matrix with our initial vector in order to get the new vector. Matrix multiplication works the following. The element of the first row and first column of the first matrix gets multiplied with the element of the first row of the second matrix. The element of the first row and second column of the first matrix gets multiplied with the element of the second row of the second matrix. The element of the second row and first column of the first matrix gets multiplied with the first row element of the second matrix, and the second row and column element of the first matrix gets multiplied with the second row element of the second matrix. Then we perform a subtraction in the first row and an addition of the second row. This will give us the new point. So let's say we take this vector and we want to calculate its new location after we perform a rotation. If we perform a matrix multiplication with our scaling matrix, we end up with the same vector, and that is because we haven't defined any rotation angle yet. I'll bring in our cube again so we can visualize it better. If I change the angle and update the formula on the fly, you can see how it gives us the new coordinates of the pixel we focused on. You can check the coordinates below the viewer when I hover over it to see that those values match up. So, scaling and rotation move everything around the origin without moving the origin itself. For translation though, if we add a vector to all points, we are also adding it to the origin, hence moving it away from 0, 0. There's a way to combine a linear transformation like rotation with a translation. We call this an affine transformation. It still is a multiplication and a vector addition though, but we can use a little trick to fix this. By adding an additional dimension, we move our origin into 3D space. We simply add a 1 as the third coordinate. That way we can map it to every value we want as long as we preserve the 3D origin. So if we want to combine the rotation and translation matrix, we end up with 3 columns. By adding that third dimension to our vectors, we also enable it for multiplication. Because for matrix multiplication, the number of columns in the first matrix must be equal to the number of rows in the second matrix. As we saw, each entry in the product matrix is the dot product of a row in the first matrix and a column in the second matrix. How can we describe an unchanged or initial state of an object without any transforms applied? If we think about real numbers for a second, the number 1 plays quite a unique role. The product of any number a and 1 is a. In the world of matrices, we have what is called the identity matrix. It is set up in a way that every matrix you multiply with it stays unchanged. You can look at it as the representation of our 3 dimensions we choose. The first row is the x-axis, the second row y, and the third row z. The first column describes our vector facing towards x, the second column describes our vector facing towards y, and the third column describes our origin, being offset 1 unit into z space. Since we also deal with 3D spaces and coordinates in Nuke, we have to use the trick we used before and add an additional dimension to our matrices in order to protect our 3-dimensional origin. I told you that Nuke is using matrices and matrix multiplication under the hood to process transformations. The great thing is you can access the matrix of any transform node. It is a hidden knob though, but we can view it via Python. I select my transform node and store it in a variable called node. I access the knob called matrix and store it in a variable called matrix, which I can print. Now we get something similar to a list with the individual values of our matrix. Since I didn't perform any transformation operations, this script gives us the identity matrix of the transform node. For convenience, I set up this little interface, which basically is a Nuke matrix node, so we can print our values into a proper matrix layout. If I gather the matrix values of the transform node, it also outputs the identity matrix. Let's change some values in the translation knobs. If we run the Python script again, we will see that the identity matrix got multiplied with the translation matrix of our new values. Our interface also prints the correct values. Let's have a look at how we can express the most common transform operations in a matrix. This is a pure translation matrix. We ignore the z values for now since we concentrate on the 2D transform today, but if I change the translation values, it will be represented in the matrix like we saw before. If we plug this node into our script, it will use this matrix to multiply every single point with it. All the zeros help us to be left with a simple calculation. If we pick our point example from earlier, we will basically end up with a vector addition. This is the rotation matrix we looked at before, now in a 4x4 grid. It's a raw rotation around the origin, no translation to the origin included. If you remember, I explained earlier that if your center point is anything but 0, we have to include a translation to the origin before we rotate, and another translation back to those center coordinates after. Look at this knob as another translation operation within this node, which is used for all the transform operations except translate. Let us quickly rebuild this example with our own matrices. We will use Nuke's own Python math module, nuke.math, that gives us access to matrix and vector classes and some functions they come with. First, I collect a couple of attributes from our transform node, like the translation and center values. Additionally, I've created some custom knobs on this transform node to do some math for us. The sin knob gives us the result of the sine function of the rotation angle. The cos knob, the result of the cosine function. It is important to say that I had to convert the angle first, since the sine and cosine functions expect radians. I create lists mirroring the values from our translation and rotation matrices. And now I use the math module to create 4x4 matrices. As you see, we have to call the makeIdentity function on them in order to assign those identity matrix values. Otherwise, a newly created matrix will have random values that resemble their position in memory. I assign all the lists to their individual matrices via a while loop. And now the final calculation. And I repeat, this is how Nuke internally calculates this operation. We started with the identity initial matrix, multiply it with a translation matrix for some potential translation. Multiply this with a translation matrix to offset our image to the origin by taking the values from our defined center point. Then multiply it with a rotation matrix, and finally multiply it with another translation matrix again to move all the points back based on the center value. If we compare our calculation with the actual knob value print, they match. And just to make it clear, it's not the case that Nuke multiplies every single point of our image with the translation matrix, and then with the rotation matrix, and then with another translation matrix, and so on. That would slow everything down so much. What Nuke actually does is it multiplies all the matrices, and only then this one resulting matrix is multiplied with every point of the image. Combining multiple operations in a matrix is also called a homogeneous transform matrix. This leads us right to an important topic called concatenation. But first, quickly finish up our look at some other transform matrices. This is a scale matrix, scaling right around the origin, ignoring an additional translation. Here is an example of a matrix multiplication for scaling with values we used earlier. And here we have our skew x and skew y operations. The transform node has an invert checkbox which uses a function to invert the whole combined matrix of the node. Alright, concatenation. We talked about the improved performance by multiplying all transform matrices of the transform node before multiplying it with the pixel values. This also works across multiple transform nodes. Concatenation means that the node can look upstream and check if the input is performing a transformation. And if it does, it takes the matrix of the input node and multiplies it by its own matrix. That can go on and on until there comes a node that can concatenate. Only then the matrices and potential filtering is applied. Nuke will choose the filter settings of the last concatenating node to process the output. If we compare the filter types of these first three transform nodes, the first two are using very soft filters. But when we view the stack through the third node, this is the filter type Nuke will calculate for the overall matrix filtering of these three individual transformations. In this case, sync 4. If we switch to the fourth transform node and view the stack through it, the filter of the third transform gets ignored, and now the Mitchell filter is in control. So wherever we would place our right node in the stack, the last concatenating node of the stack before the right node would dictate the filter, unless there is a node in between that breaks concatenation. If I enable this grade node that doesn't support concatenation, our final output changes. Nuke now uses the filter type of the third transform node to calculate the filtering of the combined matrix of the first three transforms, and then it will calculate a new matrix with a new filter type on top for the fourth transform after our potential grading changes have been applied. Here's a quick overview of nodes you find in Nuke's transform menu and their ability to concatenate. It's important to mention that there are not only nodes that can or can't concatenate, there's also a group of nodes that can concatenate with upstream nodes, but not downstream, meaning they don't send a matrix out themselves. As a rule of thumb, you can say that if a node has a filter knob, it is very likely that this node can concatenate upstream. If there are motion blur knobs, then the node can most likely concatenate up and downstream. If you want the best results and performance, you keep your concatenating nodes stacked together. Talking about stacking nodes, transform matrices are not commutative, meaning the order is important. You cannot rearrange the order and expect the same result. In this example, I'm using one single transform node to do a bunch of different operations. On the left, I created a stack of transform nodes with each of them only performing one of those operations. In the same order they perform those operations within the single transform. You can see that those two approaches produce a different output. On the right side, I mixed up the order. This produces another version. Also, if you want to invert a stack of transformations, you have to respect the order and work backwards. Since we finished up the stack with the rotation, you have to use the inverse matrix of the rotation first, then the translation, and so on. Since we started with the skew x operation, we will have to finish the inverse stack with it. And since we are talking about transformations, in case you don't know this very handy shortcut, with Ctrl arrow up and down you can move nodes through the stack. Translation operations alone are commutative though. Here you can see two stacks of transform nodes only using translation. The right side is linked with the left side via expressions, but the order of the nodes is changed. Yet, they produce the same output. Before we jump to the next section, I'm happy you made it through that dry topic, but being able to understand and work with transformation matrices and vectors can bring you to a whole new level. We will learn of some examples to use in production in part 2 of this episode available soon, so watch out for it. Alright, filtering. If you're not really familiar with the process of convolution, I would recommend watching the Unleash the Node episode about the blur node, where you can get a short and visual introduction to the concept. It will definitely help understanding filtering in general. So, if we perform a translate operation with integer numbers for our translation vector, we are mapping all pixels to a new location of pixels. If we are not using whole numbers for translation, or if we rotate, scale, or skew, we come into the situation where either pixels are being moved a fragment of a full pixel, or in the case of resizing, we suddenly have to come up with a whole bunch of new pixels. Those are situations where filters come into play. They give us control over interpolation. Scaling is a good example to use to dig deeper into this. Let's say we've got a 3 pixel by 3 pixel image. For convenience, we will work with gray shaded values so we don't have to deal with multiple channels. We want to scale this image by a factor of 3. As we've learned, this will create a 9 pixel by 9 pixel image. If we would multiply the coordinates of those pixel values by 3 and place them in their new positions, we end up with a lot of empty spaces in between them. There's no pixel in this 3 by 3 image that maps to this pixel in the 9 by 9 version. It would be a pixel somewhere in between here. First of all, this process actually works the other way around. The 9 by 9 image gets created first, and then for every pixel we look back to the original image and see where we are supposed to get our sample from. In computer graphics, there are 3 common groups of sampling: nearest neighbor, bilinear, and bicubic. The simplest method to sample is the nearest neighbor method. For every new in-between pixel, we examine the distance to available values and then take over the value that is the closest. For bilinear interpolation methods, we assume that there is a straight line between pixels. If we look at those 2 pixel values in this direction, we can say that this pixel would be 1/3 along the way and this one 2/3. To calculate this missing value, we only have to multiply 1/3 by 190 and 2/3 by 181 and then add it together. We'll get 184 as a result for this one and 187 for that one. This is a linear interpolation, and since we actually perform it in 2 dimensions, it is called bilinear. If we imagine that those are the pixel values that are known to us, the nearest neighbor interpolation calculates the new values like that. You can understand why the resulting image can look very pixelated. The bilinear function calculates the missing values like this. Let's talk about the other common interpolation method, and this is the one we actually use the most these days. It is called bicubic interpolation. It can take longer to process, but it gives us smoother results and fewer interpolation artifacts. The bilinear function gives us smooth results between the known values, but with those spikes you can see that we can get some ugly, jagged edge results in areas with high contrast. On the other hand, because of the linear distributions, which can be seen as blending values, we can also end up with reduced contrast overall. That is why for photos and complex graphics we use bicubic interpolation. This method also looks at those 2 points and where they are, plus we get 2 extra bits of information, which is what the orientation or the tangents at these positions are. So it's actually using cubic splines. And you can see why this method or function produces smooth transitions, since it also has to observe the next point to each of the 2 points in order to calculate the tangent. If we use this in 2 dimensions, we are talking about 4 by 4 pixels, which is 16. Bilinear interpolation, on the other hand, only takes 4 pixels, 2 by 2, into account. Bicubic interpolation can do more complex shapes. Actually, we can combine this one dimension followed by another dimension operation into one matrix multiplication. This optimization helps us to perform it more quickly. Nuke's transform node is mostly using bicubic filters. There's another interpolation method that we can use besides the ones we talked about, but I'll get to it in a minute. The first method available in the filter dropdown of the transform node is called impulse. It basically is a version of the nearest neighbor method. If you scale up an image by a factor of 3, the impulse method will use the value of 1 pixel from the original image for 3 by 3 pixels of the new image to fill in the gaps. This method is not really creating new pixel values, it only creates copies. Those 2 images look identical, but the one on the left is a 3 by 3 grid of pixels, while the one on the right is built up of 9 by 9. It is the scaled up version of the left one using the impulse filter. It preserves sharp details and pixel art, but is not really useful for photographic images and can create blockiness. Let's have a closer look at the other filter types. They can produce much different outputs, but it's very important to understand the individual functions so we can use them deliberately. In order to get a good visual representation of Nuke's filters, I'm resizing this white rectangle, switching through the different algorithms and plotting a curve, so we can see what happens to the edge pixels of the rectangle. Like we saw before, the impulse filter just copies existing values and we don't really get any real interpolation. By doing that, it can introduce resizing artifacts like blocking or aliasing. The cubic filter emulates a Gaussian blurring filter. It uses curves so the image undergoes some smoothing. Blurring can be seen as an artifact though, and the better the algorithm, the less blurring of sharp edges there is. The keys filter also uses curves, so we get a smooth result, but in addition it does something else. If we zoom in, we can see something interesting happening here. The curve actually dips down when we go from a low value to a higher value, and it shoots over the actual high value before it settles down again. What this means is that it increases the difference between adjacent pixels, if there's a difference in value, which increases the contrast and makes the image seem sharper. The Simon filter increases it even more, while the Riffman filter produces significant sharpening. With those last filters we might fight the blurring, but this can now introduce other artifacts. We can end up with haloing or ringing around sharp edges or moire effects. Also watch out for negative values caused by the dip-down curve. We do have the option to clamp filter, so they won't go below 0, but you can also convert your image to log space before applying them, so you don't have to cut off the curve. The Mitchell filter was picked by a subjective testing as being a compromise between all 4 general resize artifacts. Mitchell gives us some smoothing, a bit of edge sharpening, but it also blurs the image slightly to hide pixelation. While it is very slightly blurry, it isn't overly so. That's why it is also the default filter used for image enlargements. Parson is a very smooth low-pass filter. It is the most smoothing filter available in our selection here. It eliminates high-frequency noise, but it also degrades the image details a lot. The notch filter produces a flat smoothing. Where low-pass filters cut off all signals above a specified frequency, notch filters remove only a narrow band of frequencies. They pass frequency components below and above the notch frequency. You can see it as a combination of a low and high pass filter. That helps to hide moire patterns or buzzing edges. The last 3 filters belong to the same kind of group of windowed sync filters. In practice, a sync filter is often multiplied by another function that goes to 0 after some distance. So windowed means that the filter actually consists of 2 functions. The sync filter is a special high quality filter, very good for downsizing images. It manages to retain small detail with good anti-aliasing. It does not blur the image more than necessary. It is a very complex filter. Many of the weights are negative. That means the filter will subtract some of the nearby color pixels from the final color for each pixel. The result is a strong sharpening of the edges of objects. The filter needs to offset those negative weights by more positive weights along the curve, which produces a wave-like function. These extra lobes of positive and negative weights can cause ringing artifacts in images with very strong color boundaries or high contrast. Lanczos filters are a variant of sync filters with less sharpness and ringing. The number behind those 3 filters show us the width of the filter in pixels. Here you can see a little overview of all those filters applied while resizing the same image. Also clearly visible, the ringing or haloing of certain filter types. That's how it looks like when applied in log space. This is a more extreme example, basically zoomed into 9 pixels of this stock picture, but it's great to see what actually happens on a pixel level. The smooth distribution of the cubic function, the increase and sharpening of the other filters with pushing pixel values below 0, the heavy softening of Mitchell, the frequency flattening of the notch filter to avoid flickering and moire. For this example, I'm scaling down the image to show what kind of a good job those windowed sync filters do, compared to other filters that use too much smoothing for this specific purpose. And again, converting to lock space helps me to prevent the presence of artifacts. If we enlarge this image, Mitchell does a good job without smoothing or sharpening it too much. Sync or lenses deliver too much sharpening. At last but not least, an example for rotation. For this case, Simon seems to do a good job to maintain the level of the detail of the original image. So you can see often we have to decide case by case, but we have a lot of options to choose from, and that's why we do have all those filters available. They all do a good job, we just need to decide which one fits our approach. A lot of nodes from the Transform node group offer the black outside checkbox. I have to refer you to the blur episode of Unleash the Node again if you want to know more about how filtering and convolution works. Filters usually take blocks of pixels into account in order to calculate new values, and Nuke usually stretches pixel values at the edges of the frame further outside into the non-visible area. And that is to pretend or support the illusion that although we look through a restricted window of the camera, the world continues beyond those borders. So when a filter kernel moves over those edges, we will end up with a better average calculation or representation, pretending there is more information available. If we hit the black outside checkbox, we disable this approach and there will only be pure black around the image. This is sometimes needed to avoid certain artifacts or stretching, but for filtering it mostly makes sense to keep it deactivated. So this example here is showing the effect of a blur, averaging pixel values that continue outside of frame versus averaging values with black outside. And we made it to the last section of the Transform node, motion blur. Taking a photo or a sequence of images, a video, means exposing either film or sensor with light. We never capture a single instant of time though, we always expose over time, the shutter speed. It's the amount of time a camera's shutter is open. The amount of light that reaches the film or sensor is proportional to the exposure time. If we halve the exposure time, we will let in half as much light. Sometimes we need a specific shutter speed in order to capture enough light to actually create a bright enough image. And sometimes we pick the shutter speed based on an artistic or storytelling approach. Either we want to tell a story of movement, or we want to accomplish a look of subjects frozen in time. As soon as we move objects around in Nuke and we animate that movement by setting keyframes over time, we unlock the possibility to use the features of motion blur too. It is particularly important to properly adjust those settings when we have to match scenes captured in a camera or rendered by 3D packages, so they blend in together. We create the illusion that this composite was captured by the same camera as one image. The shutter angle is a way to describe the shutter speed relative to the frame rate. This term is based on actual rotary shutters that old film cameras used, where a disc with an angled opening spins in front of the actual film strip and only lets in light once per revolution to expose each frame. The larger the angle, the slower the shutter speed. Current cameras don't necessarily control shutter speed this way anymore, but we still use the terminology to describe the character of motion blur. 360 degrees would match the whole duration of one frame. If we work with 24 frames per second, it would mean a shutter speed of 1/24th. The most common setting for cinema has been a shutter angle near 180 degrees. For a frame rate of 24 frames per second, that would be a shutter speed of 1/48th. In Nuke, we set this value independently from the frame rate, since we actually work with single images in Nuke, and frame rate only becomes important when we preview image sequences or render them as video. So that way, if we change the frame rate in the settings of our script, the motion blur doesn't change. We define the shutter speed based on a single frame. The standard value of 0.5 means nothing else than an exposure time of half 0.5 frame, which, as we just talked about, means we are matching a 180-degree shutter angle. The shutter offset knob allows us to shift the exposure time around the current frame. There are a few things to watch out for when adjusting this. The default setting is set to start, which in our case means the shutter opens at the beginning of the frame, here frame 1, and closes mid-frame. It all looks fine, but if we jump to the end of our animation curve, we don't see motion blur on the last frame. This happens because the square has already arrived at its end position when the shutter opens, so there is no movement to capture. If we set the shutter offset to end, we suddenly see motion blur because it means that the shutter closes before every frame starts. It opens midway through and closes at the end of the previous frame. So when we look at frame 12, the square still inherits the motion blur from the movement it does on frame 11. If we now jump to the first frame, we now suddenly see no motion blur here. Same reason. There's no animation or movement before frame 1. So the first shutter opening happens from mid-frame 0 to the end of frame 0. If we set the shutter offset to center, it seems to bring back some motion blur, but it is based on a bit of movement and a bit of standing still. Center means that the shutter opens around frame 1. With our setting of 0.5, it opens for the last quarter of frame 0 and closes after the first quarter of frame 1. So it depends on what exactly we want to tell and capture. If we want to tell that the square starts moving on frame 1, setting the offset to start would make sense, since we want to show the initial move. If we want to pretend that the square was moving before our shot starts, then we either have to set one or multiple keyframes on the frames before, or we go to our animation curve and set the curve interpolation to linear. We can do the same for the endpoint, and then the curve will continue beyond our manually set start and end keyframes. If we now set the shutter offset to start or end, it looks like the square is moving before and after we cut to our shot. The motion blur knob is our quality setting. With this value, we can decide how often the object is sampled over the shutter time. The higher the number, the smoother the blur. That means also less artifacts. In many cases, a value of 1 is good though. If the shapes are more complex, you want to raise this value. The default setting of 0 means motion blur is disabled. Something important here. We know that multiple transform nodes concatenate, but as soon as you enable motion blur, the chain stops right there, unless the following nodes also have motion blur enabled. In that case, they keep concatenating. Here we have two individual animations of a cube. Motion blur is disabled. I want you to clearly see what happens. The first animation moves the cube up while it rotates around itself. The second animation only moves the cube to the left, without any rotation. If we combine those two nodes and activate motion blur on both, the transformations concatenate and the motion blur gets calculated only once and applied to the combined movement. In this case, the cube is moving up, rotating around itself, but it also moves to the left at some point. If we break concatenation, the motion blur gets applied for the first animation with the cube moving up. Then we add a separate animation with the already motion blurred image moving to the left, causing an additional motion blur calculation being added on top. This brings part 1 of this episode to an end. Watch out for episode 2 when we talk about how we can accomplish camera shakes, chromatic aberration, glitching effects, and lens breathing. We will also take a look at how we can blend between transforms and how we can combine multiple transforms into one. So, I will see you soon.